It was a quiet Sunday morning in Tallahassee, Florida, when a 911 dispatcher picked up a call that would set off one of the most disturbing investigations the city had ever seen. The caller's voice was shaky, laced with panic, but what he reported didn't sound quite right. "There's a woman, she's hurt. Please, she's not breathing. I think she fell. She fell down the stairs." The address he gave was 1412 Magnolia Street, a modest brick home nestled beneath the shade of sprawling oak trees. It was the kind of neighborhood where people still waved to each other from their porches, where kids rode bikes in the evenings, where crime was something you read about in the newspaper, not something that landed on your doorstep. When first responders arrived at the scene, they immediately knew this was no ordinary accident. Inside the house, sprawled across the bottom of a narrow staircase, lay 67-year-old Margaret Halloway. Her body told a story that contradicted every word of the 911 call. Her face was swollen, mottled with deep purples and reds. Her arms bore scratches that looked less like the result of a fall and more like the desperate marks of someone trying to fight back. Her neck carried dark bruises that no stair rail could ever leave. And perhaps most chilling of all, blood patterns across the hardwood floor didn't line up with a tumble. They lined up with repeated blows. Paramedics checked for a pulse, but it was too late. Margaret was gone. The man who made the call, Paul Whitaker, stood nearby, wringing his hands, repeating the same story over and over. "She fell. I told her to be careful. She just slipped." But detectives arriving on scene, seasoned men and women who had seen their share of tragedy, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Something was off, terribly off. The house itself gave away clues that the caller's story couldn't explain. The staircase banister was intact, dust on the rail undisturbed. No overturned furniture nearby, no splintered wood, no broken glass that usually comes with a fall in such a cramped space. What there was, spatter across the living room wall, droplets leading from one end of the room to the staircase, and an eerie silence that hung over everything. Detective Angela Ruiz later described it as walking into a crime scene that was screaming the truth, while the suspect kept whispering lies. Neighbors had already gathered outside, whispering among themselves. They all knew Margaret. She was Miss Maggie to them, the retired schoolteacher who kept roses blooming in her garden, who handed out popsicles to neighborhood kids in the summer, who walked to church every Sunday, rain or shine. They knew she was frail in health, but strong in spirit, and above all, careful. She didn't just fall. Not like this. Inside, officers began to separate Paul from the scene. His calmness struck them as strange. He wasn't rushing to Margaret's side, wasn't demanding doctors save her, wasn't breaking down at the sight of the woman he claimed to love. Instead, he hovered near the doorway, arms crossed, occasionally asking if he could leave now. When detectives noticed fresh red scratches on his forearms, he claimed they'd come from trimming rose bushes the day before. But a neighbor standing outside shook her head when asked quietly. "He hasn't been near those roses in weeks," she muttered. The paramedics wheeled Margaret's body out under a white sheet, and a hush fell over Magnolia Street. The once ordinary home had become the scene of something far darker than a tragic fall. Detectives began their work immediately. Photographs of the scene, measurements of the blood patterns, collection of fingernail scrapings. They noted bruises in various stages of healing across Margaret's arms and legs, signs that whatever happened that morning may not have been the first time violence touched her life. Back inside the station, Detective Ruiz typed the first words of what would become a chilling case file. Victim, Margaret Halloway, 67 years old. Apparent homicide. Possible blunt force trauma and strangulation. Primary suspect, Paul Whitaker. Spouse. Yet, what no one realized in that moment was how deep this case would go, how layers of lies, manipulation, and cruelty would unravel in the weeks to come. Margaret's death wasn't the result of a single moment of rage. It was the culmination of something calculated, deliberate, and monstrous. The scratches on Paul's arms, the too calm demeanor, the impossible accident, these were just the surface cracks of a story far more disturbing. The truth of what Margaret endured in her final hours would freeze the blood of even the most seasoned investigators. And the secrets hiding inside her home would reveal not just a single crime, but a pattern of darkness stretching back years. The house on Magnolia Street would never be the same again. And as the medical examiner prepared to begin the autopsy, detectives braced themselves for confirmation of what they already suspected. This wasn't a fall. This was murder. But before we can understand what really happened on Magnolia Street, we must first understand who Margaret Halloway was, the life she built, the people she loved, and the small vulnerability that made her the perfect target for a predator. To the people of Magnolia Street, she was simply Miss Maggie, not Margaret Halloway, not the woman whose life would one day headline newspapers. Just Miss Maggie, the friendly, soft-spoken neighbor who always made time to wave, who never forgot a birthday card, and who made the kind of pies people still talk about at church picnics. Born in 1956, Margaret had lived her entire life in Florida. She was the daughter of a Navy mechanic and a homemaker, growing up in a modest two-bedroom house in Jacksonville with her two sisters. From the start, she was known for her resilience. Childhood friends would later recall how, even in the face of family struggles and financial hardship, Maggie always seemed to be the one who smiled, the one who encouraged others, the one who carried herself with a quiet strength. Her adult life wasn't easy. She had married young, raised one daughter, and after years of teaching elementary school, she retired earlier than planned due to health issues. Her husband had passed away from cancer more than a decade before her death, leaving her alone to navigate the long, quiet years that followed. But Maggie wasn't the type to give up on life. She poured herself into her granddaughter's upbringing, into her rose garden, and into volunteering at the local food pantry. She had built a reputation not only as kind but trusting, perhaps too trusting. Her daughter, Susan, would later tell investigators, "Mom just always believed the best in people. She thought if you were kind to others, they'd be kind back." That was how she lived. Neighbors agreed. Miss Maggie would lend her tools, bake for the sick, drive elderly friends to their doctor's appointments. She radiated a warmth that made her beloved. But behind the smile, there were signs of loneliness. She lived alone in her 3-bedroom brick home on Magnolia Street, the same home she'd moved into after her husband died. Holidays were filled with laughter when family visited, but the rest of the year was long and quiet. Maggie would sometimes sit out on her porch late into the evening, watching cars go by, as though she was waiting for something or someone. By 2020, at the urging of a church friend, Maggie decided to take a small leap of faith. She dipped a toe into online dating. She wasn't searching for fairy tale romance. At 64, she wanted companionship, conversation, and perhaps someone to share the small pleasures of daily life. Morning coffee, walks in the park, Sunday service. Her first experiences were awkward. Friends later recalled her joking about young men who just want money, or suitors whose profiles seemed too good to be true. But then she met a man whose words seemed to cut through her hesitation, a man who told her exactly what she wanted to hear. His name was Paul Whitaker. He introduced himself as a retired Navy officer, a man who had traveled the world, who was ready to settle down in a quiet town with someone who valued loyalty and kindness. He told Maggie he admired her faith, her resilience, her devotion to family. He said he wanted a partner for the rest of his life. It seemed like destiny. To her neighbors, it was as though Maggie bloomed overnight. She laughed more, seemed energized, walked with a lightness that hadn't been there for years. She told her daughter she'd finally met someone who understands me. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of love again. When Paul moved into her home less than a year later, most neighbors accepted it as a happy turn of events. He was polite, well-dressed, and always quick with a story from his supposed Navy days. But beneath the charm, a few people noticed cracks. He kept to himself, rarely socialized with the neighborhood the way Maggie did. He had a temper, subtle but sharp, the kind that flickered in his eyes before he caught himself. One neighbor would later recall hearing muffled arguments through the open kitchen window at night, Maggie's voice pleading softly, followed by silence. Still, Maggie defended him. "He's just under stress," she told her daughter when Susan raised concerns. "He's a good man, you'll see." But the truth was more complicated. Paul Whitaker had not served in the Navy. He was not retired military at all. His record, hidden carefully from Maggie, was littered with fraud, theft, and multiple accusations of domestic violence from past partners. He had drifted from state to state, leaving behind a trail of suspicion and broken trust. And now, he had found someone who believed in him without question. Someone whose home, savings, and unwavering kindness made her the perfect target. Margaret's trusting nature, the very trait that had made her beloved in her community, would become the crack in her armor. The thing Paul saw, not as beauty, but as opportunity. Detectives reviewing her life would later say, Maggie wasn't just unlucky. She had been hunted. By the time she realized who Paul really was, it would be too late. The autopsy results on Margaret Halloway would confirm what detectives already suspected. She hadn't fallen at all. She had been beaten, strangled, and left to die in her own home. But even more chilling, the evidence pointed to a man who was living under her roof. The body of 67-year-old Margaret Halloway was transported to the Leon County Medical Examiner's Office on the evening of March 3, 2023. While her neighbors wept in shock, outside the brick home on Magnolia Street, inside the sterile halls of the morgue, a different kind of story was about to unfold. One written not in words, but in bruises, broken bones, and blood. The lead medical examiner, Dr. Alicia Norman, had been in her field for over 2 decades. She had seen tragedy in every form imaginable: accidents, suicides, murders. But when she first laid eyes on Margaret, even she paused. The injuries were extensive. The pattern wasn't random. It was systematic. The first and most obvious detail was the bruising around Margaret's neck. Deep, dark contusions encircled her throat in a way that suggested hands, not a fall. Pressure marks aligned with thumbs and fingers told the unmistakable story of strangulation. But this wasn't the only trauma. Her skull bore fractures inconsistent with impact from stairs. Instead, they matched blunt force trauma from a rounded, heavy object. Something swung repeatedly, with enough force to fracture bone, but not enough to completely crush. The forensic team noted lacerations across her scalp, bleeding into the tissue, proving she was alive during the assault. Her arms and hands were covered in scratches, not random scrapes, but defensive wounds. Margaret had fought. Blood beneath her fingernails was carefully collected, later to be tested against the DNA of anyone who might have come into contact with her. Then there were the bruises in different stages of healing along her torso and thighs, some fresh, others weeks old. It painted the picture of a woman who had suffered repeated assaults long before the day she died. The official cause of death: homicide by blunt force trauma and manual strangulation. Dr. Norman wrote in her report, "The decedent's injuries are incompatible with accidental fall. Evidence of prolonged assault present. pattern consistent with interpersonal violence. For detectives, this was the turning point. The story Paul Whitaker had told on the 911 call, the tragic fall down the stairs, was no longer just suspicious. It was impossible. Crime scene analysts returned to the Magnolia Street home with fresh eyes. This wasn't a household accident. It was a staged murder scene. Blood spatter on the living room wall, once puzzling, now made perfect sense. Cast-off patterns indicated repeated strikes from a swinging weapon. Droplets leading from the kitchen to the staircase suggested Margaret had been attacked elsewhere and dragged. Detectives also noticed something subtle but chilling: the absence of a murder weapon. Whatever Paul had used, hammer, mallet, or some other blunt object, was gone. Police scoured the house, the backyard, the trash bins. Nothing. But neighbors had seen Paul walking his dog shortly before the 911 call. One mentioned he'd taken an unusual detour that morning, heading toward a drainage ditch 2 blocks away. That detail, minor at first, became critical. When investigators searched the ditch, they found exactly what they feared: a blood-stained rubber mallet partially submerged in mud, its handle wiped but not clean enough to hide the truth. Alongside it lay a cell phone, cracked and waterlogged, later confirmed to be Margaret's device. Both items were collected as evidence. Forensics linked the mallet directly to the crime. Blood matched Margaret's DNA. Fibers from the handle matched those found on her clothing. But perhaps most damning, DNA under her fingernails, collected during the autopsy, returned a match: Paul Whitaker. It told the story investigators already suspected. Margaret had fought for her life. She had clawed at her attacker's arms, leaving behind scratches that officers had noticed when they first arrived. Paul had explained them away as gardening wounds. The truth was far darker. As detectives pieced together the timeline, the evidence grew overwhelming. Security footage from nearby homes showed Paul leaving at 8:30 a.m. with the dog, carrying a bag. At 8:45, he was seen tossing something into the drainage ditch. By 9:10, he was back inside, calling 911 to report a supposed fall. The sequence was too neat, too rehearsed. A man trying to script his way out of murder. But evidence doesn't lie. As the case file thickened, investigators began digging deeper, not just into the crime, but into the man at the center of it. Who was Paul Whitaker really? What past did he carry with him when he moved into Margaret's life? Detective Ruiz would later put it bluntly: "We knew Margaret didn't just die. She was killed." The question became, how many lies had been told before that day? That question would open the door to a past littered with red flags, fraud, failed relationships, restraining orders, and violence. A past Margaret never knew. And as detectives prepared to confront Paul with the evidence, DNA, weapon, timeline, they began to see a portrait of a man not just guilty of one murder, but of living a life built entirely on manipulation. The autopsy had spoken for Margaret. Now it was time for the lies of Paul Whitaker to speak for themselves. When investigators peeled back the layers of Paul Whitaker's past, they uncovered a history of deception and violence that made one thing terrifyingly clear: Margaret Halloway was not his first victim of cruelty. When detectives turned their focus from the crime scene to the man at the center of it, they quickly realized Paul Whitaker wasn't just hiding a weapon, he was hiding a life. The charming, well-mannered, retired Navy officer who had swept Margaret off her feet didn't exist. The uniform he boasted about, the medals he claimed to have earned, the tours of duty he described in late-night conversations, all of it was fabrication. What investigators uncovered instead was a man with a record of deception stretching back decades. Paul Whitaker had never served a single day in the United States Navy. In fact, his work history was riddled with inconsistencies. job applications that listed different employers in different states, and resumes padded with unverifiable credentials. Employers who had briefly hired him in the past described him as personable at first, but quick to show a temper, quick to take advantage, and quicker still to vanish when accountability caught up. It was in relationships, however, where the darkest truths emerged. Court records from Alabama revealed that in 2007, Paul had been accused of domestic assault by a former girlfriend. The woman, whose name we'll withhold, told police that Paul had controlled her finances, isolated her from friends, and lashed out violently when she tried to leave. The charges never stuck. She dropped them out of fear, she later admitted, but the report remained on file. In Georgia, a 2011 restraining order filed by another woman painted a chillingly similar picture. She described a man who was charming at first, but turned manipulative, jealous, and violent. She alleged he had threatened to ruin her life if she ever exposed him. That case, too, dissolved quietly in court, leaving Paul free to move on. By the time he met Margaret in 2020, Paul had left behind a trail of broken relationships and frightened women. But because none of his prior cases had led to serious convictions, he was able to present himself as exactly what Margaret wanted to believe: a stable, respectable man looking for companionship. It was more than just lies about who he was. It was calculated hunting. Detective Ruiz later said, "He knew how to pick his victims. He looked for women who were older, widowed, or financially stable. Women who were lonely but kind. Women like Margaret." Neighbors who had once been polite about Paul began to open up when detectives asked pointed questions. One said he never saw Paul at community gatherings. Another recalled how Paul discouraged Margaret from attending church as often as she once had. Others mentioned how she seemed quieter, less open, after Paul moved in, subtly withdrawn from the vibrant woman she had always been. Susan, Margaret's daughter, told detectives she had been deeply uneasy from the start. "He was too smooth, too quick to move in. I told Mom it didn't feel right, but she just kept saying, 'He makes me happy. He understands me.'" Investigators believed Paul's motive wasn't love at all. It was control. He had access to Margaret's savings, her home, and her trust. Records later revealed that in the months leading up to her death, more than $18,000 had been transferred from her accounts into joint holdings with Paul's name on them. But money wasn't his only motive. The autopsy suggested weeks of prior abuse, bruises hidden under clothing, injuries Margaret never reported. Detectives speculated she had been enduring Paul's temper for months, perhaps longer, quietly hoping things would improve, unwilling or too frightened to tell her family. What ultimately pushed him from abuser to killer would come to light soon enough: a confrontation, a threat to expose his lies, and the looming fear that his carefully built house of cards was about to collapse. But before that final trigger, investigators needed to build the full picture of Paul's pattern, and the deeper they dug, the more disturbing it became. One ex-partner described him as a master manipulator. Another recalled how he pretended to be a decorated firefighter to impress her family. In each case, his stories were elaborate, consistent enough to be believable, yet impossible to verify when pressed. He had a talent for weaving fantasy into reality, long enough to gain trust, long enough to take what he wanted. Psychologists later testified that Paul fit the textbook profile of a narcissistic sociopath. He lacked empathy, thrived on control, and believed he was smarter than everyone else around him. His confidence in his lies was so strong that he expected people to believe them simply because he said them. That arrogance, investigators noted, was already showing in his behavior during questioning. He smirked when confronted with evidence, dismissed forensic results as coincidences, and at one point leaned back in his chair and said, "You're wasting your time." She was clumsy. That's all. But he was wrong. The evidence was mounting, the facade was cracking, and investigators were about to uncover the moment where all of Paul's lies collided with Margaret's strength, the moment that sealed her fate. It wasn't just a murder. It was the violent conclusion of a confrontation Margaret herself had started. In the days before her death, Margaret discovered a secret that shattered the fantasy Paul had built, a secret that turned love into rage and companionship into cold-blooded murder. In the weeks leading up to her death, Margaret Halloway's world had already begun to unravel in ways only her closest family noticed. Her daughter, Susan, recalled that Margaret seemed more distracted than usual, more hesitant when speaking about Paul. Neighbors who once saw her gardening daily noticed she was inside more often, curtains drawn, her once bright laughter muted into silence. What no one realized at the time was that Margaret had started to see through the cracks in Paul Whitaker's carefully polished mask. The first sign came from something small, a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Paul had boasted to Margaret and anyone who would listen about his years of service in the Navy, about his honorable discharge, about the benefits he still supposedly received. Yet when the letter arrived addressed to him, Margaret couldn't help but notice the words at the top: claim denied, no service record found. When she confronted Paul, he dismissed it with a chuckle. Clerical error, he said, happens all the time with the government. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The second blow came when Margaret accidentally opened a bank statement addressed to Paul. Inside, she found not deposits from a pension, but overdraft notices, missed payments, and debts she had never known about. The man who presented himself as financially secure was drowning in unpaid bills. Finally, the truth struck her hardest one night when she picked up Paul's phone while it buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text preview glowed across the screen. "I miss you. Can't wait until our next trip." The message wasn't from her. It was from another woman. Scrolling through, Margaret found weeks of messages romantic, intimate, and damning. Paul hadn't just lied about his past. He was still living a double life, courting another woman while living under her roof. The betrayal cut deep. Friends would later say Margaret wasn't naive. She had known relationships were complicated, that people carried flaws. But what she saw that night wasn't just imperfection. It was fraud. It was manipulation. It was cruelty. And Margaret did something Paul never expected. She stood up for herself. According to Susan, Margaret confided in her days before her death. She admitted she was planning to end the relationship. More than that, she was going to expose him. Margaret told her daughter, "If he thinks he can use me, he's wrong. I'm not going to let him get away with this." Her plan was simple but devastating. She would report Paul's lies to the authorities, his false military claims, his financial fraud, his exploitation. She would also cut off access to her accounts, reclaiming the money he had already siphoned away. For Paul Whitaker, this wasn't just a breakup. It was a catastrophe. If Margaret followed through, he would lose everything: the house, the money, the respectability he'd carefully crafted. Worse still, exposure could connect him to past crimes and bring law enforcement down on him in ways he had always avoided. To Paul, the problem wasn't his lies. The problem was Margaret. Detectives would later theorize that in the days between her discovery and her murder, the house on Magnolia Street became a pressure cooker. Arguments grew louder. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices at night, though the words were muffled. One neighbor swore she heard Margaret shouting, "You lied to me!" followed by the sound of something heavy slamming against a wall. On February 28th, Margaret called a close friend from church. Her voice was shaky but determined. She told her friend she was going to meet with an attorney about her finances and that she might have to make some big changes. The friend urged caution, but said Margaret sounded resolute. By March 1st, Paul had grown noticeably tense. A coworker at a temporary construction job recalled him snapping at a supervisor, muttering, "I've got enough on my plate at home." Another acquaintance remembered him bragging that, "Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Not her. Not anyone." The final straw came on the evening of March 2nd. Margaret and Paul ate dinner together at home. At some point during the night, Margaret told him flatly that she was done. She was contacting her bank in the morning. She was meeting her daughter for lunch, and she was going to the authorities with what she knew. For most people, this would have been the end of a relationship. Painful, perhaps messy, but survivable. For Paul, it was unthinkable. In his mind, Margaret wasn't just leaving, she was destroying him. That night, he began to plan. Investigators later pieced together his movements. Internet searches on his phone about how to clean blood off walls, and death by blunt trauma. Withdrawals of cash from their joint account. A trip to the hardware store, where he purchased cleaning supplies, gloves, and most chillingly, a rubber mallet. By the time March 3rd dawned, the decision had already been made. Paul waited for Margaret to finish her morning shower. He waited for the sound of the bathroom door opening, the creak of her slippers across the hall, and then he struck. The brutality of the attack would later be revealed in full detail by the medical examiner, but in those moments, inside the quiet house on Magnolia Street, Paul's fantasy life finally collapsed into blood and silence. And while he thought he could stage it as an accident, dispose of the weapon, and walk away, Paul overlooked one thing. Margaret herself had already begun leaving behind a trail of evidence texts, phone calls, and words spoken to loved ones that would expose him long after she was gone. Detectives now had the victim's voice preserved in the testimony of family and friends, pointing squarely at Paul Whitaker's motive. But the investigation was far from over, and soon evidence would surface that stripped away his lies, layer by layer. From the moment detectives stepped into the Halloway home, they knew Paul Whitaker's story of a tragic fall couldn't hold. The autopsy confirmed their suspicions. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed evidence strong enough to withstand a courtroom battle. And in the weeks following Margaret's death, that evidence began to appear piece by piece, like puzzle fragments falling into place. The first came from her fingernails. Lab analysis revealed DNA that wasn't hers. The profile was a perfect match to Paul Whitaker. Forensic experts testified that Margaret had fought for her life, clawing at her attacker in a desperate attempt to survive. The scratches on Paul's arms weren't from rose bushes, as he claimed they were the living proof of her final resistance. But that was only the beginning. Detectives canvassed Magnolia Street, gathering statements from neighbors. One couple recalled seeing Paul walking his dog on the morning of March 3rd. Nothing unusual, except for the fact that he had taken a route he never used before. His path led straight past the storm drain, 2 blocks from the house. When investigators matched the timing with security footage from a neighbor's porch camera, the truth became undeniable. Paul had been seen tossing a bag into the ditch at 8:45 a.m., just minutes before dialing 911. Inside that ditch, police found the murder weapon, a rubber mallet soaked with blood and hair, later confirmed to be Margaret's. Alongside it lay her cell phone, smashed but not completely destroyed. When digital forensic teams recovered fragments of data from the device, what they found drove the case home. A draft message Margaret had begun writing, but never sent, was still saved in her notes app. "Susan, I have to tell you, Paul is lying about everything. I found out the truth. I'm going to the bank tomorrow to..." The message cut off mid-sentence, time-stamped less than 12 hours before she was killed. Now detectives had both physical and digital evidence that Margaret had uncovered Paul's lies and intended to expose him. Meanwhile, her daughter Susan and several close friends gave sworn statements. They confirmed that Margaret had spoken to them days before about her plan to leave Paul and report his fraud. One friend from church recalled Margaret saying, "I've been such a fool, but I'm not going to let him take everything." These testimonies provided motive, directly linking Paul's fraud to Margaret's death. Still, Paul held to his story. During questioning, he repeated his version with mechanical precision. He had gone for a walk with the dog, returned, and found Margaret at the bottom of the stairs. He insisted he never touched her. But detectives had something he didn't expect: his own phone data. Cell tower pings and GPS logs placed him in the exact area of the storm drain at 8:45 a.m., contradicting his claim that he never left his usual route. Internet search history recovered from his phone revealed chilling queries in the days before the murder. How to make a fall look real. Death by strangulation time. Cleaning bloodstains from wood floors. When confronted with the evidence, Paul shifted his story. First, he claimed Margaret had injured herself during an argument. Then, he suggested an intruder had broken in. Finally, in desperation, he accused Susan, Margaret's daughter, of staging the whole thing. But every lie collapsed under scrutiny. There were no signs of forced entry. Susan's phone records and workplace logs placed her miles away at the time of death. And most damning, only Paul's DNA appeared under Margaret's nails. The case against him was becoming airtight. Yet detectives knew it wasn't enough to prove murder. They needed to prove premeditation. And that proof came from an unlikely source. At a local hardware store, security cameras captured Paul purchasing gloves, bleach, and the very same model of rubber mallet found in the ditch. The receipt was time-stamped just 2 days before the murder. When shown the footage, Paul tried to laugh it off, claiming he was doing some home projects. But the mallet's bloodstains told a different story. District Attorney Carla Jennings would later call it the holy trinity of evidence: the DNA, the weapon, and the digital footprint. Combined, they painted a picture of a man who planned, executed, and tried to cover up the cold-blooded murder of the woman who trusted him most. Yet, even as the evidence piled high, detectives knew they weren't dealing with an ordinary suspect. Paul wasn't just lying, he was performing. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, that he could twist the narrative, cast doubt, and walk away. And for a while, he had done exactly that in his past relationships. He had left behind frightened women who never pushed charges, who never stood their ground. But Margaret had been different. She had fought back with her words, with her actions, and in her final moments, with her hands. Now, her fight was echoed in the courtroom to be, where the evidence of her strength would stand against the man who silenced her. Detectives prepared their case file for the prosecutor, confident they had enough for an arrest. But they also knew this case was going to be a war. Paul wasn't the type to confess. He wasn't the type to show remorse. He was going to fight every inch of the way, clawing to maintain the facade that had finally crumbled. And when his trial began, the mask would slip even further, revealing the full measure of his arrogance, his cruelty, and his utter lack of humanity. In the courtroom, Paul Whitaker would finally be forced to face the evidence of his lies and brutality. But even there, he tried to spin a web of deception, turning against Margaret's grieving family in one of the cruelest twists of all. By the summer of 2024, the quiet neighborhood of Magnolia Street had become synonymous with tragedy. The brick home where Margaret Halloway once waved from her garden now stood silent, blinds drawn, a constant reminder of the brutality that had unfolded within. But inside the Leon County Courthouse, the case against Paul Whitaker was just beginning to reach its most dramatic stage. The prosecution laid out their case with methodical precision. Jurors were shown the rubber mallet, streaked with Margaret's blood. They listened to forensic experts describe how the injuries on her skull could only have come from repeated blows, not a fall. They saw security footage of Paul tossing a bag into the storm drain and heard about the DNA under Margaret's fingernails that matched his own. To anyone watching, the evidence seemed overwhelming. But Paul Whitaker was not a man who admitted defeat. From the moment he entered the courtroom, dressed in a pressed suit and wearing the faintest smile, he radiated the same smug confidence detectives had seen in the interrogation room. He shook his attorney's hand with theatrical warmth. He nodded politely to the jury as though they were acquaintances, not arbiters of his fate. And when testimony turned against him, he leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly, as if he knew something others didn't. The defense strategy was clear: muddy the waters, cast doubt, and most cruelly shift blame onto others. In his attorney's opening statement, jurors heard a shocking claim. The defense argued that Margaret's own daughter, Susan, might have been involved in her mother's death. They suggested that financial disputes and family tension could have escalated to violence, leaving Paul as nothing more than a grieving husband caught in a nightmare. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Susan sat frozen, tears running silently down her face. For her, the accusation wasn't just insulting, it was devastating. She had lost her mother in the most brutal way imaginable, and now the man responsible was trying to paint her as the killer. The prosecution moved swiftly to dismantle the claim. Phone records, workplace logs, and security footage proved Susan was miles away at the time of the murder. But the damage was done. Paul had planted the seed of suspicion, forcing Margaret's family to endure not just grief, but public insinuation. Next, the defense suggested a burglary gone wrong. According to this version, unknown intruders had entered the home, killed Margaret, and fled before Paul returned from his walk. But again, the evidence destroyed the claim. No forced entry, no missing valuables, no strangers caught on the security cameras. When confronted with his own internet searches, how to make a fall look real, cleaning blood from wood floors, Paul's attorney argued that they were taken out of context. He claimed Paul was morbidly curious, not planning murder. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, many exchanging skeptical glances. But the most telling moments came when Paul himself chose to take the stand. In a calm, measured voice, he repeated the story he had told from the beginning. Margaret had fallen. He described her as clumsy, claimed she had been dizzy lately, and said he had found her already gone when he returned home. He looked directly at the jury, his expression one of feigned sincerity, his words carefully rehearsed. Yet when prosecutors cross-examined him, the cracks appeared. "Mr. Whitaker," the prosecutor asked, holding up photographs of his scratches, "if these came from rose bushes, why did DNA analysis show Margaret's blood under her nails?" Paul's jaw tightened. "I can't explain that. Maybe she grabbed me when she fell." The prosecutor raised the mallet, sealed in its evidence bag. "And this? Your purchase 2 days before her death? Your disposal of it in the drainage ditch? Was that part of her fall too?" Paul shifted uncomfortably, his rehearsed calm faltering. I don't remember throwing anything away. That video is misleading." Jurors leaned forward, watching as the facade began to crack. Still, Paul clung to his arrogance. Even when cornered with facts, he refused to admit guilt. Instead, he projected blame outward, insisting that investigators had targeted him, that Margaret's family had never liked him, that the system was rigged against men like him. It was a performance, a desperate, unraveling one. And through it all, Margaret's family sat in silent agony. They listened as the man who murdered their mother tried to rewrite history, turning grief into suspicion, memory into lies. Susan later said the hardest part wasn't hearing about the mallet or the blood. It was hearing Paul say Margaret's name with mock tenderness, as if he hadn't stolen her life. The trial stretched on for 6 tense days. Witnesses testified to Paul's history of manipulation. Forensic experts dismantled every alternative theory the defense proposed. And slowly, the weight of evidence pressed down until only one narrative remained. Paul Whitaker had murdered Margaret in cold blood to protect his lies. By the time closing arguments began, the air in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The prosecution's final words were simple. Margaret Halloway trusted this man, and for that trust, she was beaten, strangled, and left to die. Do not let him escape the truth now. The jury retired to deliberate. For Margaret's family, every passing minute felt like an eternity. Would justice finally prevail, or would Paul's web of lies catch hold once again? After just 2 hours, the door to the jury room opened. The verdict was ready. The jury's decision would seal Paul Whitaker's fate. But even after the verdict was read, the true cost of his cruelty would echo through Margaret's family in ways no sentence could ever repair. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats. Margaret's family clutched each other's hands, hearts pounding. Paul Whitaker sat upright at the defense table, his lips curled into the faintest smirk, as though he still believed he could charm his way out of justice. The clerk asked the foreman the question everyone had been waiting for. "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The foreman stood, holding a sheet of paper that would determine the rest of Paul Whitaker's life. The courtroom seemed to shrink. Every sound amplified the shuffle of papers, the scrape of a chair leg, the distant hum of the air vents. "We, the jury, find the defendant Paul Whitaker guilty of first-degree murder." The words hung in the air like a bell, tolling for the end of Paul's lies. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Susan collapsed into tears, clutching her sister's arm. For the first time since his arrest, Paul's expression faltered. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the jury, as though betrayal had just struck him. Not that he had betrayed Margaret, but that the world had dared to hold him accountable. Judge Marianne Keller turned her gaze on the convicted killer. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her words pressed on every person present. "Mr. Whitaker, you have been found guilty of the premeditated and brutal murder of Margaret Halloway. The evidence against you was overwhelming. Your arrogance, your deception, and your violence robbed a beloved woman of her life and robbed a family of their anchor. For this crime, you will serve life in prison without the possibility of parole." Paul's smirk returned for a fleeting moment, as if he could still convince himself this wasn't the end. But when deputies stepped forward, cuffed his hands, and led him away, the performance collapsed. He was no longer the charming Navy veteran he had pretended to be. He was a murderer, stripped bare before the world. For Margaret's family, the verdict brought both relief and heartbreak. Susan addressed the court during the victim impact statements, her voice trembling but firm. "My mother was the kindest woman I've ever known. She loved her family, her community, and even when she was hurt, she believed in people. That belief was her gift and her downfall. She welcomed a monster into her home because she thought he needed love, and for that, she paid with her life. I want her remembered not for what happened to her, but for how she lived with generosity, with grace, and with hope." Another family member, her granddaughter Emily, stood with tears streaking down her cheeks. "She was my rock. She was the one who called me every day just to ask how school went. She deserved peace in her golden years, not fear. Not this. Paul Whitaker took her from us, but he can never take away the love she left behind." Jurors later said the statements haunted them long after they left the courthouse. One described Susan's words as the voice of a woman speaking not just for her mother, but for every victim who never saw justice. The community of Magnolia Street gathered that evening at the local church for a candlelight vigil. Dozens stood with candles flickering in the night, praying for Margaret's soul and for healing in the hearts she left behind. Her roses, still blooming in the garden she once tended, were clipped and handed out to neighbors as tokens of her enduring spirit. But while justice had been served in the courtroom, the scars of Paul's cruelty ran deeper than any sentence could repair. For Susan, the guilt lingered. She would later confess to friends that she replayed their last conversation over and over in her mind, tormenting herself with the thought that she hadn't done enough to save her mother. If I had pushed harder, if I had made her see the truth earlier, maybe she'd still be here. Margaret's church community also struggled. Many had welcomed Paul, invited him into services, even shaken his hand with smiles. The betrayal of their trust cut almost as deeply as the murder itself. They wondered how they could have missed the signs, how they could have been so easily fooled. For investigators, the case stood as both a victory and a haunting. Detective Angela Ruiz, who had walked into the bloodied house on Magnolia Street that morning, admitted later, "I've worked dozens of homicides, but this one stays with me because Margaret did everything right. She trusted, she loved, she tried to give someone a chance, and he turned it into her death sentence." Paul Whitaker was transferred to Florida State Prison within a week of sentencing. There, stripped of his carefully crafted persona, he became just another inmate. Yet, even behind bars, he reportedly bragged to other prisoners that he had been set up, that he was too smart for the cops. His arrogance didn't die with his freedom. And that, perhaps, was the final cruelty, that a man so empty of remorse could destroy a life so full of love. But Margaret's story wasn't over, because as her family and community grieved, they also began to speak out. Her daughter Susan started working with local advocacy groups to raise awareness about domestic manipulation and elder exploitation. Her church hosted seminars on recognizing red flags in relationships. Margaret's life and her tragic death became a rallying cry, a warning, a reminder that kindness can be exploited, but it must never be silenced. Justice had been served, but the legacy of Margaret Halloway's life and the warning her death carried was just beginning to take shape. What happened on Magnolia Street would forever change how a community saw trust, love, and the hidden dangers lurking behind charm. In the months after Paul Whitaker was sentenced, the house on Magnolia Street stood as both a shrine and a scar. The roses in Margaret's front garden bloomed bright against the weathered brick, but no one sat on the porch anymore to wave at passing neighbors. Children still rode their bikes down the street, but they glanced nervously at the home, whispering to each other about the terrible thing that had happened inside. For Margaret's family, the grief never truly lifted. The image of her last days, the bruises, the silence, the betrayal, haunted every memory. But through the pain, they began to fight for something Margaret herself had always believed in: the good in people, the power of community. Susan, her daughter, became an unlikely advocate. She spoke at local churches and senior centers, sharing her mother's story not as gossip, but as a warning. "My mother thought love could fix anyone," she told a gathering at the Tallahassee Community Center. "But love is not blind. We have to see the signs. We have to protect ourselves and each other from people who use kindness as a weapon." Advocacy groups soon took notice. The Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence invited Susan to share her story at their annual meeting. Law enforcement officers, counselors, and community leaders listened as she described the hidden manipulation Paul had used, cutting Margaret off from friends, isolating her, controlling her finances, and rewriting his past. Detective Angela Ruiz also spoke publicly about the case, urging vigilance. "Predators don't always break down doors," she told a crowd of local reporters. "Sometimes they walk in with a smile, a story, and just enough charm to make you believe. That's what makes them dangerous." They don't look like monsters until it's too late. The community of Magnolia Street responded with action. The church where Margaret had once taught Sunday school started a program to check in on widows and retirees living alone. Volunteers visited weekly, not only to keep them company, but to make sure no one was taking advantage of their trust. At the county level, legislators began drafting proposals for stronger oversight on financial exploitation of the elderly. Margaret's name appeared in committee hearings, her story cited as an example of how easily kindness can be weaponized when safeguards are absent. Her granddaughter Emily carried the legacy into her own generation. At just 17, she started a small nonprofit campaign called Maggie's Roses, distributing pamphlets about relationship red flags to high schools and youth groups. On the cover was a photo of her grandmother smiling in her garden, surrounded by the flowers she loved. The campaign's slogan was simple: love should never hurt. Even beyond Tallahassee, Margaret's case spread through true crime podcasts, news articles, and advocacy reports. She was no longer just Miss Maggie of Magnolia Street. She had become a symbol, a reminder of the silent dangers of manipulation and the courage it takes to stand up to deception. But with the legacy came lingering shadows. Neighbors wrestled with guilt. One man admitted to police that he had overheard arguments between Paul and Margaret, but dismissed them as normal couple stuff. Another recalled noticing her bruises but choosing not to ask. These small silences weighed heavily on them after the truth emerged. "Maybe if I had spoken up sooner, she'd still be here," one neighbor confessed during a vigil. It was a sentiment echoed by many, fueling a determination never to ignore red flags again. Even among detectives, the case carved a permanent mark. Ruiz admitted that Margaret's trust reminded her of her own grandmother, and that the sight of Margaret's lifeless body on the floor of her home would follow her for the rest of her career. "She wasn't just another case file," Ruiz said quietly. "She was every grandmother who believes too much in the good of people, and she deserved better." In that way, Margaret's story became more than just a crime. It became a mirror, forcing people to ask hard questions about the nature of trust, loneliness, and the thin line between kindness and vulnerability. And yet, amid the grief, there was a strange kind of defiance. Margaret had been silenced by Paul's violence, but her story refused to fade. Every candle lit in her memory, every rose planted in her honor, every speech given by her daughter was a rejection of the cruelty that had tried to erase her. Her legacy was not the blood on the walls of her living room. Her legacy was the garden she tended, the family she cherished, the community she helped build, and the movement she inspired. But even as her family and neighbors found ways to honor her life, one question lingered in every corner of the community. How many others, like Paul Whitaker, were still out there charming, deceiving, hunting? It was a question without an easy answer, and it ensured that Margaret's story would never be just a memory. It would be a warning, carried forward. And so, as the roses continued to bloom on Magnolia Street, the community remembered Margaret not for her brutal death, but for the light she left behind. Yet her story asks us all one final chilling question. What would you see if the monster lived inside your own home? The roses on Magnolia Street bloomed long after the trial ended, their petals bright against the brick house that had become a monument to both kindness and cruelty. Neighbors walked past quietly, sometimes stopping to leave flowers of their own, sometimes pausing only to whisper a prayer. Inside the courthouse records, the case was closed. Paul Whitaker would spend the rest of his life behind bars, stripped of the mask he had worn so convincingly for so long. But for Margaret's family, for her friends, and for her community, the story was never really over. Margaret was not defined by the brutality of her death. She was defined by the life she lived, by the warmth of her laughter, the generosity of her spirit, and the unshakable belief that people, at their core, were good. That belief was both her greatest gift and her fatal flaw. The truth of her murder forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes evil doesn't come as a shadowy figure lurking in an alleyway. Sometimes it comes as a smiling man at the dinner table. Sometimes it wears a suit, tells charming stories, and claims to love you. That is what makes stories like Margaret's so haunting. They don't just expose the horror of one crime, they force us to see the dangers hidden in plain sight. Her daughter Susan later said something that still lingers. "If it could happen to my mother, it could happen to anyone. Please, don't ignore the signs. Don't let kindness blind you to danger." The signs were there: the rushed romance, the isolation from friends, the financial control, the subtle temper. Each on its own might have seemed small. Together, they formed a pattern, a warning that Margaret, in her trust, couldn't see. Forensic files will remember the mallet, the bruises, the DNA. But the greater lesson is this: monsters rarely announce themselves. They build their lies brick by brick, until the walls around their victims feel like safety instead of a cage. On Magnolia Street, a life full of kindness was extinguished by cruelty. But that kindness endures, in every rose planted, in every story told, in every warning carried forward. Margaret's life still speaks, even through the silence Paul tried to leave behind. And now, her story belongs to us. We carry it not just as tragedy, but as armor, to protect ourselves, to protect our families, to see the red flags, to ask the hard questions, to never let charm become a disguise for control. Margaret deserved safety in her home, peace in her golden years, and love free of deception. She didn't get that. But we can honor her by making sure others do. If you take anything from Margaret's story, let it be this: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Speak up. Ask questions. Protect those who may not see the danger themselves. Because monsters don't always break in from the outside. Sometimes they're already sitting at the table. If this story moved you, share it. Keep Margaret's legacy alive. And remember, in a world where kindness can be exploited, vigilance is not paranoia, it is survival.